Welcome, everybody. I'm sorry that it's been a while, but a lot of things have changed up. I've had to move places, and as a result, the channel basically became a secondary element for me. But I'm back, and I'm here to talk about history again. And as re-entry into recording, I've decided to make a presentation and to speak about how America became a country, as that was a presentation I've had with a student that I've shared with a student a while back, and it's something I have on hand. And I presume, at least I would hope that this would be an interesting subject to cover, and I hope that this can help out in any attempts to learn about this topic for anybody who is interested, for anybody who has to learn about it. And as usual, whenever you talk about historic events, like the founding of the United States, you have to mention context. Context is always a crucial element of history, and it is always a crucial element of analyzing history because history is a process. And in this case, the process, you can argue, started with the colonization of North America by the British and the French. Obviously, there were other countries which participated in the colonization of America. Sweden and the Netherlands, most notoriously, also had colonies in North America, and as visible on the diagram, which I'm sorry it isn't too clear, the Spanish occupied what is modern day Florida. You can see right here. That's Florida. And other than that, the map that you see shows the situation from right before the 7 Years' War. You have the British territories over here, the 13 colonies, and you have the nominally British controlled Canada here. Here you have the French controlled New France, that becomes Quebec, and later on part of Labrador, which is connected to Newfoundland here. And also the entirety of the Louisiana Territory, which remains French prior to the 7 Years' War and prior to the conflict which would bring about the creation of the United States. Important in this case, the important parts are here around the Great Lakes region, since that was the main area of dispute between Britain and France. Most notably, the region that is modern day Ohio and Pennsylvania were crucial parts of this dispute. Um, if I remember correctly, this area was pretty rich in resources like furs, and as a result, it meant a lot to both Britain and France. Additionally, it was a region bordering one of the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes could function as both a source of water for colonists and it could function as a potential a potential avenue of defense, since obviously at this time boats were not exactly a common thing across American riverways and waterways. Um, around this time, uh, the time that this dispute is occurring, the British send an incursion into the French territories in Ohio and Pennsylvania, and these are led by one George Washington. Uh, in this escapade, the British troops murder a senior colonial officer uh, for France, and the French are obviously not too pleased with that fact. They attempt to hold the British incursion accountable. They hope that the United Kingdom of Great Britain can investigate the matter. The British refuse, and as a result, the French attempt to attack the British at Fort Necessity, an attempt which for the French is successful. This is what many people consider, many historians consider the beginning of the 7 Years' War, a conflict which sometimes is called the first globe-spanning conflict, and as a result, the first major conflict that you can call a world war. But what matters to us here is that Britain wins, albeit at a huge cost. That huge cost is going to be something that matters significantly when we talk about the reasons why America revolted, because those costs came to the British at the expense of the British in an attempt to defend their colonies in America. The British see it as money they spend to make sure that the colonists can remain British, and they expect a return on the investment that they made into protecting the colonies during the 7 Years' War. As written here and as seen on the graphic, Britain needed a way to get more money out of the colonies to cover the cost of the extremely expensive conflict that they just fought with France. And their way to do that was by levying taxes. They not only passed new tax laws and implemented completely new taxes, but they also imposed trade restrictions on the Americans alongside those taxes. More often than not, it meant that importing materials like sugar, tea, molasses, or other goods from outside of the British sphere of influence and apart from British companies was delegalized, and all imports from British companies, British territories, or from Britain itself were taxed additionally. One of the more famous taxes came from the Stamp Act, whereby every document page that got stamped was also taxed, meaning that you had to pay for every stamp. Another very infamous tax would be the tax on tea, which we'll talk about later on as well. But to summarize how these taxes had an effect, the people of America, at this time the 13 colonies, were not happy. They were furious about being taxed, especially because they were not represented in British Parliament. The only representation in British Parliament existed for people living in Britain. The colonists, being on a completely different continent, didn't have any representatives, and as a result, many considered the new taxes levied on the levied by the British on the American colonies to be unfair and unjust. The famous way of describing this is taxation without representation, and this is what you will often hear in American schools. And it's correct, because, again, there were no representatives of the 13 colonies and the people of the 13 colonies in Parliament when Parliament was levying these taxes. Notably, though, it has to be stated that these weren't exactly foreign ideas or foreign concepts. The idea of levying taxes on colonies has been pretty regular in colonial policy for a long time at this point. When a country was struggling, it would impose higher taxation and it would exploit the colonial regions more in an attempt to shoulder the costs of protecting them and to shoulder the costs of conflicts in Europe and so on and so forth. The difference here was that, unlike, for example, Spain or France, which were absolutist monarchies with no representation for anybody, Britain had its parliament. The parliament was the legislative body, and the king was not an executive was not at least he wasn't the executive branch that we would normally recognize. As a king, even to this day, has very little influence on the sway in British politics, both as custom and as a legal basis. Um, Moving on, here I attempt to describe some of the responses that the Americans gave. Notably, they began to boycott British goods, and they began to illegally smuggle goods from modern day Florida, back then Spanish Louisiana, and from French Louisiana. Both of these regions not only were under control of foreign powers and were nearby, meaning that it was easy to smuggle from, because it's most, as anyone accustomed to geography knows, America is very, very flat until we get to the Sierra Nevada and to the Appalachians. Between the Appalachians and Sierra Nevada, or the Rockies, or any part of uh, the West Coast, it's very flat. And it just so happened that some of the British colonies were on that very, very flat region. Places like Georgia, places like North Carolina, South Carolina, or Virginia were all found on this very, very flat piece of land, which made it very easy to smuggle goods across. Especially since at this time proper border guards essentially didn't exist, and they hadn't existed essentially since the Roman times, uh, because because it was just not feasible economically to guard such huge stretches of land in a colonial region. And this smuggling that resulted from poor border protection essentially led to the subversion of British taxes, and many things, such as the Stamp Act, would be rescinded. Other things like the Sugar Act or the Molasses Act, these taxes that levied extra costs on the Americans for buying these goods, those were also dropped because smuggling was just so intensive at this time. One tax that was not lifted, however, was the tax on tea. And notably, in December 1773, as a way to protest this act, to protest this tax, a group of colonists from a so-called patriot organization in Boston, boarded a British tea vessel and threw 10,000 pounds of tea, or about 5 tons, into the harbour. This is known as the Boston Tea Party. Um, if I remember correctly, this group of patriots, so called, was called the Brothers for Liberty organization, and they went onto the ship dressed up as American Indians as an attempt to maybe frame this on the Native American population, which would be stupid because they're white. Native Americans aren't white, or at least they don't. They would be pretty recognizable to the inhabitants of Boston and the British Guards as non-Europeans and as such non-white, because that's the definition that we're using here in this case. The British responded to this by occupying the city. Notably, it was during this occupation that the Boston Massacre takes place. Essentially, as British troops begin to land in greater number in Boston, the locals begin to dissent, they begin to protest, and they begin to harass the British guards who are landing. Finally, after enough rocks were chucked and British troops were injured, one of the guards decides to open fire, leading to a whole volley of fire from British troops onto Boston residents, which results in I'm pretty sure 5 people dying. This was probably the least brutal massacre of any massacre ever. In response, though, uh, because there were local news organizations, there was a local press, and this press was very heavily anti-British at this point. The entire tragedy in Boston got blown out of proportion, and the ensuing outrage led to the remaining colonies calling a congress in Philadelphia, uh, with Boston and essentially all of Massachusetts under British control. The other colonies begin to realize that this might be the time that the British begin to finally enforce their control over the colonies, which prior to now had quite a lot of liberty. To just show real quick how great this level of liberty was. Technically speaking, the colonies were set up by noble families or by lords with permission from the king. These were often not directly under the rule of the king. When these nobles died, more often than not, the actual ties that the colony had to the king and to Britain were very limited. And as a result, for a very long time, the American colonies could act as they wished, do as they wished. The people living there were not as strictly governed as those in other areas, simply because there wasn't really much of a reason to govern them as strictly. Um, this obviously changed after the 7 Years' War. Britain needed a way to get its money back, and it decided that it's going to start to govern these colonies more. This leads to outrage because taxes without representation, and then this Congress, because the states that formed in the 13 colonies do not want to lose that degree of independence that they had before, which partially also came from the fact that they didn't have any representatives in British Parliament, but I digress. The decision made on this Congress, also in 1773, was that they would begin to organize a militia. This militia would have a role in the potential conflict that was to take place. However, the people at that very first Congress still wanted to negotiate with the British. They didn't want uh, to break away from Britain just yet. They didn't consider that a feasible option, but they were considering that they would have to fight, and potentially through that fight achieve representation, maybe getting their own members of parliament, or at the very worst, in the very worst case scenario, they would get uh, independence. But that was still a very fringe idea. This was not exactly a mainstream idea in American politics at the time, and certainly most members of the Congress were not considering independence seriously. The start of the revolution is 1776. Well, not really 1776, but the revolution begins as this Congress, which is at the same time organizing militia, at the same time writing a letter to the British government to potentially achieve a bloodless reform, a bloodless change. And where I was going with this, but essentially, Congress is organizing a militia and it is negotiating with Britain at the same time. The British do not know that the Congress in the 13 colonies is building a militia, and so they refuse. They do not consider that the Americans would actually revolt and actually attempt to break off from Britain, because Britain was considered a major military power at the time, and the colonists knew that. That's why independence was so unpopular originally. Nobody thought it feasible that the colonies could break away from Britain. Uh, but nonetheless, they did organize a militia just in case. And when the British received the letter calling for the instatement of representatives for the colonies in British Parliament so that Americans could have an influence on the taxes that they had to pay, the British refused. They downright refused that offer, and as a result, the Americans began to prepare. The militia was called up on standby, and finally, a British force began to move out of Boston, and um, well, as you can read here, the first encounter of the war happens at Lexington, just outside of Boston. The Americans are pushed back by the British because at this time the militia force that was prepared at Lexington was a bit too small. However, um, this British excursion force is ambushed by Americans at around Concord and pushed all the way back to Boston, which goes under siege. Um, the first, one of the major legends, the first few legends of this time for America included that famous ride through Boston, which said that the British are coming. That's probably not true. It probably was something more like the Redcoats are coming, because at this time, most residents were considered themselves British. Many considered themselves American, of course, but many of them still considered themselves British, and for many people, British and American were synonymous with each other. These were two synonymous terms for some people, because, well, to be an American in the American colonies, you had to be British. Nonetheless, uh, going away from that fact, Britain uh, realizes that they are in a bit of trouble, especially as a group of mercenaries in the region under Ethan Allen take the heavily fortified position at Fort Ticonderoga, Ticonderoga being in somewhere around Pennsylvania. This was important, very important, because Ticonderoga was a very heavily fortified position. It had cannons, it had huge stores of munitions, it had a very sizable garrison for a fort at the time, and so taking it meant that you could move the cannons and the munitions from Ticonderoga to the siege of Boston, and that could result in a disaster for Britain. If you lose Boston, you lose the one place that you control, and as a result, your next offensive has to come from all the way across the Atlantic, or through Canada. And funny enough, the force under Ethan Allen attempted to attack Canada, but failed because the British contingent guarding Canada was more prepared and it was better armed. The British notably also didn't want to get Canada involved because potentially, if they got Canada involved, then they could potentially lose more money on the incentivizing and conscripting of the Canadians into the war, and as a result, the they would run into a similar situation where Canada would be too much of a burden in this war financially, and they would have to get their money back somehow. They didn't want to risk it again, especially with how things were now going in America. the British realized that it just wasn't worth it. The Americans also began to form their first proper army around this time. This is 1776 now, um, under the command of that very same lieutenant that started the 7 Years' War by complete accident, that being George Washington. Washington notoriously uh, notoriously was the only man in the entirety of the first class of uh, American politicians and patriots who had any military background. He was the only man in the Congress at Philadelphia to see conflict, to see war. So, as a result, it was natural for him to be the first in command. Though notably, he also never really achieved a high rank in the British Army. So, while he was an officer, he he certainly wasn't any like general or anything. He wasn't a tactical mastermind. Uh, how the revolt turned into a war uh, is also pretty interesting because the siege in Boston didn't go smoothly for the Americans. The British attempted to break out of the siege by attacking at Bunker Hill, and they succeeded because the Americans ran out of ammunition, and the British ended up sustaining some 1,000 casualties, um, though, again, notably, while that number might seem like it isn't too large for an army, considering that we often in history hear of armies in the tens of thousands, this was huge. Because at this time, the forces that were actually in Britain, from Britain, in America, in Boston, were a couple thousand strong. So 1,000 casualties, whether it be deaths or severe injuries, meant that the British force in Boston was significantly weakened. The losses were too great to fully complete the breakout, and the Americans just came back to Bunker Hill and reoccupied it later on. Washington would finally receive the weapons captured from Ticonderoga a couple of weeks later. These weapons were set up on another hill overlooking Boston, and finally, to avoid the bombardment, the British just up and left. The victory was monumental to the American cause because uh, this siege, the success of the Americans in this siege, showed the empires of Europe, showed the powers that would normally oppose Britain that this was serious. Britain lost the primary point from which they could exert their control, the only area which they had under direct occupation, to a force of militias and mercenaries. The best army on earth at the time, lost against its own people. France and Spain finally took a vested interest in the American cause, with a diplomatic mission from the Americans being sent to Paris not long after. This was led by one Benjamin Franklin, who we might talk about later on. As for the colonies, the war ended up being the spark leading to a full declaration of independence on July 4th, 1776. It was meant to be July 2nd, but in the end, they ended up signing everything on July 4th, which is where we get the American Day, Independence Day from. Uh, this now that the declaration is signed, we know that the declaration was signed July 4th, 1776, and the lead up to it, which was the capture of Boston and the elimination of British forces from the region of the 13 colonies. I would like to take some time to talk about the actual declaration itself. It is probably one of the most famous documents in the entirety of history. It is directly tied to the Bill of Rights. Notably, both of these documents were written by the same man, Thomas Jefferson. If I remember correctly, it was Jefferson who wrote both of these documents. And then he was also the man who would go on to write much of the Constitution, or at least the original Constitution. But that would come later. This was the first declaration that directly called for inalienable rights for all men. And I'm saying all men because I mean all men. Women were still second-class citizens in this case. Notably, all men are created equal, this famous quote that comes from the Constitution, from the Declaration of Independence, was also not really brought into reality for centuries onward. If you want to argue, you could say that it hasn't been implemented to this very day, because black people were notably still kept as slaves. Black men were still horribly treated, especially down south, and it was also notable that many of the people who signed off on the Declaration of Independence and who signed off on the Constitution were slavers. They owned slaves, sometimes in the hundreds. They were very rich people, which is why they could own so many slaves. But still, this was the first document to be brought into legal reality, which declared the existence of inalienable rights and the equality of all men. This was a huge step because no other place at the time even considered these things as real, as existing. Soon after declaring independence, the US would decide on its founding document. Nowadays it's the Constitution, but it wasn't that originally. It was originally the Articles of Confederation. This was accepted in 1781, which notably means that America was fighting a war for 5 years with absolutely no founding legal document, which makes sense because it takes time to create founding documents. And notably, the Articles of Confederation would function for 7 years until the Constitution was adopted in 1789. Why was the Constitution created in that case, if we already had the Articles of Confederation? Because the Articles of Confederation were horrible. They were a terrible legal document. They were a terrible basis for law, because the government created in the Articles of Confederation was too weak. The federal government might as well have not existed. And individual states had significantly more power than the power that they were given in the Constitution. The issue here being that America was kind of fighting a conflict, and even after the war, such a document could not keep the country alive. Why? Because states acting as essentially countries were very, very prone to get into conflict between each other. If two states get into conflict between each other, start arming militias, start fighting, that could bring the entire union down as states secede or break away. over often very trivial matters, at least at the federal level. So, seeing that issue with no federal government, no federal army, meaning that states essentially acted as countries, and the United States as a nation was it might as well have not existed because it wouldn't have in any practical sense. It all meant that the Articles of Confederation would be very quickly replaced. And for many Americans, probably happily so. Especially since the Articles of Confederation uh, also would have meant that every single America wouldn't have been able to grow to the size that it is at, mainly because states would have been fighting between each other more than they would have been expanding the country. But also because without them, America would have been without the Constitution, with the Articles of Confederation, the US would have been significantly more divided than it is today along state lines. But back to the war, because America couldn't have been winning forever. This was still a fight against the greatest military force on the entire planet at this point in time. So the British sent a new force under General Howe, which landed in New York before sailing around New Jersey. They defeat Washington multiple times and end up capturing Philadelphia, which forces Congress to leave for a different place. Further up north, much of upstate New York, north of where General Howe landed, was also captured by one General Burgoyne. And they were only beaten back by one Horatio Nelson, who led a counteroffensive, returning the border to previous status. Basically, this was the counteroffensive from Canada, started by General Burgoyne, which then Nelson was able to defeat. Notably, this is not the same Nelson who fought on the Trafalgar. To not get those two confused. This was the end of all operations from Canada, because again, even this offensive itself was not hugely popular, but it was part of a plan to end the war quickly. When it failed, it only reinforced the idea that it's better to not get Canada involved in this conflict. But the many defeats that the Americans suffered would prove to be a bit of a reality check for the Americans. Because the original victories in places like Boston might have given them too much hope relative to the actual chances of success that they would have had. So, realizing that to fight the most professional force on Earth, you also need to have quite a professional army yourself. The Americans brought in Prussian instructors. Additionally, Benjamin Franklin attempts successfully to negotiate support from France and Spain, with both countries joining the war on the side of the Americans against Great Britain. This combination of factors means that Britain is now split between multiple places. It has to defend the English Channel so that the French don't do the obvious and just walk to Britain, march on to London and stuff like that. They have to protect their supply lines across the Atlantic because the Spanish have a pretty good navy themselves. And they also have to fight against a significantly more professionalized American force than the one that they had to face earlier. The one against which they lost, by the way. So Britain is very split, and the costs are starting to run high. This sort of chaotic situation that the Americans caused for the British mean that the British get pushed out of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Philadelphia is taken back. Congress is able to move again, and uh, the northern situation begins to shift significantly towards the advantage of the revolutionaries. However, what I forgot to mention is that down south, the British had taken both the Carolinas as well as Yorktown, Virginia. Why is this important? Because Carolina, Virginia, these were places which were uh, very rich, for one, because these were very flat regions where plantations could be planted en masse. And so these were the places which were producing most of the goods that America was selling at this point in time. And additionally, uh, these were places full of loyalists. The South was significantly more loyal to Britain than the North was, partially because the South was richer, and additionally, many of the goods that were taxed by the British were produced in the South, meaning that people in the South had greater access to these goods, and so could often acquire these goods, like sugar, like molasses, like tea, like coffee, before they got into British hands and before the British could actually tax them. Uh, so these places were more sympathetic to the British, and the British could, as a result, take these territories back and not have to occupy them too significantly, or with, so they could actually put more focus towards fighting the Americans themselves rather than attempting to keep the locals from rebelling right back. Notably, another thing that was done by the British at this time was declaring freedom for all black slaves. Something that the Americans hadn't promised and hadn't considered, which meant that many black people would defect to the British and fight on the side of Great Britain because that was what made sense to them. And I honestly cannot blame them. I don't think any American could blame them, considering that their options were a Britain that wanted to give them freedom in return for fighting against the people who were their former oppressors, or an American state which, while young, refused to give them their freedom, and because of the pressures that Southern aristocrats forced onto Congress, as well as the still pretty pro-slavery attitudes in Congress itself, would not stop the institution of slavery. Uh, this was, of course, another major setback for America, because if you have a large population living in your territory which has the option of defecting at any point in time and receiving greater conditions than the ones that they are put under, then you have to worry, you have to either appease that group or you have to suppress them. Albeit, that doesn't help the British too much. After all, America exists today. General Cornwallis, who was responsible for the offensives in the south, was sent up to the north to attempt to attack uh, to attack further north to support General Howe. Issue being that the Americans, with the help of the French, would formulate a push and attack Britain. Britain, attack Britain. They attacked the British troops in Yorktown, Virginia, which were supposed to move up north and to begin the offensive against the American North. The battle at Yorktown would end up being a major victory for a united Franco-American force, and Britain realized that it was just getting too expensive to fight this war further, especially now that American troops were bolstered by a massive French force and a massive French navy, which cost a fortune and would later bankrupt France. This all meant that Britain was forced to the negotiating table, and they signed a victorious peace for America in 1783, which was probably also fortunate for the Americans now that I think about it, because if the Articles of Confederation came into force in 1781, 2 years prior to the end of the war, and some states, like Virginia and Pennsylvania, really disliked each other, then it was very probable that had the Americans knocked the British out of the American South, the states would begin to fight amongst each other, feeling enough comfort from the British, who were no longer on the continent, to begin their internal squabbles, with the British then being able to exploit said conflicts in a second landing. But that would have probably been too expensive for Britain, considering if this war was already getting too expensive for them, which was the reason why they decided to not continue it. If they were meant to fight the French army, the American revolutionaries, and have to fight through the French and Spanish navies, just to retain colonies which were already being an economic drain after the 7 Years' War, well, they were just not going to do it. Here is the bibliography. I'll probably ask if you're in a school and I'm sending it to a teacher, then I'll probably get you should be asking the teacher to try and show you these videos as well. These were pretty important for my for the creation of my presentation and for the information that I passed on. And yeah, I don't know what more there is to say really. I could add that the American Revolution leads very well into the French Revolution, because the French poured such a huge amount of money into making sure that the Americans broke free that French coffers ran dry. And when the coffers run dry, you tax the population in the lower classes. The lower classes, burdened even more by taxes, hit with a famine because of a poor harvest, and with a French aristocracy which continuously grew fat on their own supply, revolted. The lower class broke away in France, and the French Revolution started, and that will be the topic of probably the next video. So I would like to thank all of you, and I hope you have a nice day.